Nathan is 47. He arrives at his desk at 7 in the morning and leaves, on good days, at 9 in the evening. On the days when something demands resolution, and in his field, contract law, something always demands resolution, he does not leave at 9. He has maintained this schedule, with minor variations, for 20 years. His firm regards him as foundational. His clients regard him as indispensable. His wife has stopped requesting that he attend things she knows he will not attend. His father was a civil engineer who worked the same hours. Not by Nathan's observation. His father was rarely home when Nathan was young enough to observe him. By the later account of his mother, who noted it in the kind of passing remark that children register with more precision than adults expect. His father died at 63. A cardiac event on a Tuesday afternoon, in his office. The office was in the same building where he had worked for 31 years. Nathan has not made a connection between these facts. Not because he is incurious or unintelligent. He is exceptionally intelligent, and he is, within the bounds of his professional life, a deeply careful analyst of cause and consequence. He has not made the connection because the connection does not present itself to him as a connection. It presents itself as simply what work looks like, as the nature of commitment, as the cost of the kind of career he has built. He is correct that it is the cost. He is not asked who set the price. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you are struggling, please seek qualified help. The case presented is entirely fictional, constructed to illustrate a psychological concept. The father complex is one of the foundational structures in Jung's clinical psychology, and it is also one of the most frequently misunderstood. The misunderstanding takes a characteristic form. People assume that having a father complex means having had a difficult relationship with a difficult father, a domineering or absent or actively harmful man whose presence distorted the child's development. This understanding is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. In Volume 4 of the Collected Works, Jung described the father complex as a specific activation of the paternal archetype in the personal psyche, the layer of the unconscious that has been shaped by the earliest relationship with the first significant authority figure. The archetype of the father, in Jung's framework, is not simply a memory of the actual father. It is a universal psychological structure, present in every human psyche, across every culture, organized around the themes of authority, law, tradition, the transmission of values, and the relationship between the individual and the world of power and consequence. What the personal father does, or fails to do, is to give this universal structure its particular coloring, its specific emotional content. A highly demanding father colors the father archetype with the theme of impossible standards. An absent father colors it with the theme of unreachability, the authority that is there but cannot be accessed. A father who modeled work as the primary language of value colors the archetype with the equation between labor and worth. The complex that forms around this coloring is not a memory. It is, as Jung described it in the Collected Works, a nodal point in the unconscious, an emotionally charged cluster of associated images, effects, and patterns organized around the father figure and its meaning. What makes it a complex rather than simply a memory is its autonomy. It operates independently of the conscious mind's intentions. It is activated by specific triggers without the person's awareness, and it produces its characteristic effects regardless of whether the person recognizes its operation. Nathan's 14-hour workday is not a decision. It is, at its deepest level, a complex in operation. He experiences it as a decision, as the appropriate response to the demands of his profession, as the expression of his values and his commitment. The experience is genuine. The complex does not announce itself as a complex. It presents its agenda as the person's own. James Hollis has written more carefully about the father complex in men than almost any other contemporary Jungian analyst, and his work in Under Saturn's Shadow, Saturn here being the Roman equivalent of Kronos, the father who devours his children, is worth engaging directly. Hollis identifies two primary modes in which the father complex operates in adult men, and the distinction is consequential. The first mode is identification. The son becomes the father, replicating the father's patterns without awareness that a replication is occurring. The patterns feel like the son's own values, his own choices, his own character. He works the same hours, maintains the same emotional unavailability, produces the same career at the cost of the same relational life, and experiences all of this as the natural expression of who he is. The second mode is rebellion. The son defines himself in opposition to the father, becoming the father's explicit opposite. Where the father was cold, the son insists on warmth. Where the father was conventional, the son insists on transgression. Where the father sacrificed family for career, the son sacrifices career for family. This mode feels, from the inside, like freedom, like the son's own genuine self-expression, liberated from the father's model. The psychological reality, Hollis argues, is that the rebellion is still completely organized by the father. The father is still the reference point, still the definer of the field, still the figure in relation to whom the son's identity is constituted. A life organized as the refusal of its own father is still, at its core, organized by that father. This is the clinical insight that has the most force because it removes the escape route that many people assume is available. The belief that having recognized and consciously rejected the father's patterns, they are free of them. Jung was explicit in the collected works that the complex does not respond to intellectual recognition. One can understand the mechanism of the father complex in considerable analytical detail and still be fully in its grip at the behavioral level. The complex operates beneath the level at which understanding operates. Nathan's pattern is the identification mode. He has not consciously decided to be his father. He has not thought about his father in the context of his work schedule in any deliberate way. The identification did not arrive as a choice. It arrived as the ordinary process by which children absorb, without deliberation, the models of adulthood available in their environment. Nathan's father worked 14 hours a day, and that was the primary model of what a serious man does. The model was installed before Nathan had any capacity to evaluate it, before he had a competing model to compare it to, before he had any concept of the distinction between inheriting a pattern and choosing one. What is perhaps most significant about the identification mode is its relationship to love. Nathan did not unconsciously replicate his father's pattern out of resentment or damage. He replicated it, in part, because it was the closest available connection to a man he rarely saw, but whose absence he experienced as meaningful. Working the same hours is not just a pattern. It is a form of proximity to someone who was not there, a way of being with the father through the doing of what the father did. This dimension of the father complex, which Hollis discusses at length, is genuinely poignant and generally missed by frameworks that focus only on wound and damage. The third figure in this situation, beyond identification and rebellion, is what Jung described as differentiation, or what Hollis calls the individuation of the paternal inheritance. Differentiation is not the rejection of the father. It is the conscious encounter with the father complex, the process of examining what was inherited, what in it was genuinely the son's own, and what was simply absorbed, what in it serves the son's actual life, and what serves the father's unfinished business. For Nathan, this encounter would involve asking questions that feel disloyal, which is itself part of the complex's defense. Examining the father complex feels like a betrayal of the father, which is the complex's way of preserving itself. The discomfort of the inquiry is evidence of the inquiry's necessity. The question that the father complex most resists is the simplest one. Who would Nathan be, and what would Nathan's days look like if there were no father pattern running the schedule? Not in the mode of rebellion, not the opposite of what his father did, but genuinely without that reference point. That question does not have a quick answer. It may not have a comfortable one, but it is the question on which Nathan's second half of life depends. Return to Nathan. He is 47. His father died at 63. If the pattern holds, and patterns do not require consent to hold, Nathan has approximately 16 years of working 14-hour days before the system he has been running produces its final account. He has not examined the connection. This is not negligence. The connection is not visible from inside the complex. The complex does not present itself as a complex. It presents itself as Nathan's character, his professional identity, his genuine values around commitment and service to clients. and some of it is those things. The father complex, in its identification mode, does not replace the person's authentic character. It incorporates itself into it, becoming indistinguishable until it is distinguished. The distinguishing requires a specific kind of attention, not the analytical attention Nathan brings to contract disputes, but a slower, more uncomfortable kind of examination that moves toward rather than away from the emotional content. The question of his father's death is not primarily a question about mortality or risk. It is a question about connection. Nathan worked the same hours as a man he barely knew. He has been close to his father, in the only way available, for 20 years. The grief that has never been processed, the grief for a man who was absent before he died and then became more absent through death, is not separate from the 14-hour workday. It is, in some specific sense, embedded in it. This is the dimension of the father complex that makes its examination different from simply correcting a behavioral pattern. You do not fix a 14-hour workday by deciding to work 12 hours. You encounter what the workday has been doing besides producing legal outcomes, what it has been providing, emotionally, that Nathan has had no other way to access. Hollis argues that the father wound, in men of Nathan's generation, is almost universal in its structure. The father was simply not there, not because he did not love, but because the model of fatherhood available to him did not include presence as a primary form of care. The son absorbs both the love and the absence, and when he becomes a man, he tries to honor the love while replicating the absence because absence is the only form of the relationship he actually learned. Nathan's wife, who has stopped requesting that he attend things, is not simply managing a workaholic spouse. She is living with the absence that Nathan's father gave him, replicated with the same faithfulness with which Nathan replicates the work schedule. The father complex does not confine itself to the professional life. It organizes the emotional life with equal precision. One might ask, as an honest inquiry rather than a therapeutic exercise, what the organizing principle of one's professional life actually is. Not the stated rationale, the service to clients, the financial obligations, the genuine ambition. The actual organizing principle at the level beneath those explanations. Whether the schedule one keeps, the standards one maintains, the particular form of work one does, was chosen or was absorbed from a model that was simply the most available template at a time when no evaluation was yet possible. One might also ask whether the rebellion against a parental pattern, if it has been a source of identity, has actually produced freedom or has simply produced the inverse of the original constraint, which is still, structurally, determined by that constraint. The son who defines himself as everything his father was not is still spending a great deal of energy on the father. The cultural dimension of the father complex has a specific contemporary form. The generation of men now in their 40s and 50s grew up with fathers who were, in the main, physically and emotionally unavailable in ways that were normalized by the professional culture of the mid-20th century. The wound of that unavailability has not been widely acknowledged or examined, partly because the culture that produced it regarded it as a feature rather than a deficiency, and partly because the sons who carry it have been busy replicating it. What the father complex requires, in Hollis's formulation, is not the condemnation of the father. The man who worked those hours was shaped by his own complex, which was shaped by his own father, in a chain of transmission that goes back further than any of us can examine. What it requires is the honesty to distinguish between what was genuinely inherited and what was chosen, to take seriously the question of what a life shaped by one's actual values and desires, rather than by a pattern absorbed before evaluation was possible, might look like. That question is not answered quickly. It is answered, when it is answered, through the slow work of paying attention to what is actually one's own. Nathan has 16 years, if the pattern holds, before the system produces its final account. That observation is not fatalistic. It is the kind of information that changes things when it is allowed to be real. The father complex is not a story about the past. It is a story about what the past is running in the present, on behalf of someone who is no longer alive to authorize it, in the life of someone who never had the chance to agree or disagree. Examining it is not a betrayal of the father. In the most precise sense available, it is the thing that would make the father's absence matter, the thing that converts the inheritance from a fate into a question. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you are struggling, please seek qualified help. The Shadow Work PDF, 5 Questions to Begin, is available through the link in the description. Subscribe if this kind of examination is one you want to continue.